Hello there. So, Nimona finally released onto Netflix after a rocky development cycle with Disney due to some unjust complications on the corporate end of things, but you'll be able to piece together what they may be later on. Thankfully, everything fell into place for the movie to come out, and I'm so glad I was able to watch it not long after release instead of procrastinating over the idea until it was too late. I had hopes for this movie as a whole because of the element within the time period of the powers of one of the main characters, which dragged me in hook, line and sinker. This is probably the best time to add a spoiler warning too, because I want everyone of you to experience the same story that I was gifted with. You won't regret it in the slightest. For those of you who came back, saw it close to release, or don't care at all, I'll give a brief story analysis of the movie, the clever ways in which it went about doing things before ending with my thoughts on each character that was prominent within the story itself. Trust me, if I knew a thing or two about properly reviewing things, and I'd happily make this a whole long of a video, but I fear I would ramble too much, so you get my condensed version instead, which is likely for the best. The movie begins with a fairy tale-esque opening, which is more so prominent in medieval stories, basically laying the groundwork for why the walls are important and what the threat is like on the other side. As such, it gives way to the prominent figure of this movie that is more or less kept in shot for a majority of the scenes around the city itself, that being Glorif, since she was the original knight. This is then cut forward to 1,000 years later, where everything has become futuristic, with flying cars and holographic displays being plastered all over, with items such as mobile phones being commonplace too. It is the day of the knighting ceremony, where the first commoner, known as Ballister Boldheart, is set to be knighted, which was set up by Queen Valorin in an attempt to show that anyone had the potential to also become a hero as well. This was especially important since Ambrosius Goldenloin, Ballister's partner and a descendant of Glorif, was also knighted at the ceremony, making it a bigger spectacle than ever. Things were all going so well until Ballister had his sword returned to him, as the hilt started to open up and a green beam started to charge up, only to kill the queen point blank, with the display dome falling from above soon after. During the panic, Ambrosius cleaved Ballister's arm clean off before watching as his lover fled underground with the chance he was given to escape. Time passes, a large bounty is placed upon the former knight, and Ballister is able to make a prosthetic arm from scrap parts. There's a moment of silence until the front door to his hideaway starts to get knocked heavily upon, only to reveal that it is Nimona, who had come to find him now that he was a villain. We then spend quite some time with the two trying to clear Ballister's name by whatever means necessary, with a prison break revealing Nimona's shapeshifting abilities, which easily aids in their escape. Once it becomes clear that they need to take a step back, they both go to interrogate the squire, who had Ballister's sword prior, and reveals that the Institute's director was the one who set him up in the first place. Despite Nimona's protests, Ballister returns to the Institute again to speak with Ambrosius and shows him the evidence which was destroyed after the director falsely called it a weapon. Instead of fleeing, the both of them held their ground and defeat countless knights, with Ballister bringing his concerns to Ambrosius directly until sparing him as their fight ends. Nimona would eventually become stunned after saving a young child, who in turn threatened her, since she was a monster, leaving Ballister to swoop in and save her. Back at the hideout, Nimona opens up a bit more about being seen as a monster and how she is close to giving up altogether due to how she is treated, wanted the feeling to be dismissed entirely, whether by one means or another. Ballister consoles her, and the duo create a new plan in order to get a confession out of the director by having Nimona shapeshift into Ambrosius whilst he would record it from outside. The plan works, and it sparks uneasiness within the kingdom, since the trust with the Institute was shaken at the core, now only for the director to retort by ousting Nimona as the same great shadow monster that Glorif had fought against all that time ago. Upon seeing this, Ballister confronts Nimona, after speaking with Ambrosius too, and questions whether the friendship was actually solid or just a ploy which causes her to flee whilst knights storm the hideout. After travelling far into the forest, Nimona comes across a neglected well, which gives us a look into the past where Glorif was her only friend, until one night the villagers attacked her. One of the torches was swatted away, only to set fire to the village itself, leaving Glorif to banish Nimona herself when the opportunity arose. Flash forward again, and Nimona is writhing with all the words of those she had encountered swirling round her head, before turning into the great shadow monster once more before heading for Glorif's statue. There was anger, malice, and distaste in Nimona when taking her first few steps, but it quickly evaporated into a hopelessly depressed stumble after sustaining massive amounts of damage, both physically and emotionally. Upon reaching the statue, Nimona tried to impale her heart on the sword in an effort to end her own life, after coming to her own assumption that there was nothing left for her within the walls until something pushed back against her. Ballista, despite being beaten prior, had rode towards the statue too and managed to stop Nimona from getting any closer whilst making sure she didn't fall when becoming human again. Originally, the director had turned one of the cannons inwards to kill Nimona, despite the overwhelming death it would bring to many more innocent people, yet even after there was no threat, she used the same green beam to weaken Ambrosius, who had come to stop her. Seeing that the cannon was to fire at any second, Ballista explained what would likely happen, which prompted Nimona to want to turn things around, shapeshifting into a pink phoenix and ploughing into the weapon before it could fire, destroying it and the wall, as well as sacrificing herself to stop the director once and for all. That's more or less how the plot of Nimona goes, and it shattered my stone cold heart when seeing the whole monster sequence near the end of the movie due to how everything had come together to force her to make such an assumption of herself. Nimona was never a monster, just a human gifted with the powers of shapeshifting, yet due to humans being afraid of the unknown, she was forced away from others who she would have been able to connect with, making her an emotionally unstable individual. Even during the last act, there was no fighting on her end. Nimona simply preferred to end her life the way in which legend foretold, despite the details which got left out. History was written by the victors, but as a result, it just made things far worse for future generations with a vendetta against monsters, and the walls being produced simply to hold the fear as a constant. This can be seen with the director and even with Ambrosius or Ballista, as they were brought up believing the same, with some staying true to their broken philosophy, whilst others started to bend the rules in order to understand them better. It may have taken some time, but people came around and started to question the rules eventually, especially when Nimona began prodding at Ballista to try and understand why he stands so firmly with the code that cost him his arm in the first place. Nonetheless, the amount of foreshadowing done throughout the movie was also a masterpiece in and of itself, as things are perfectly laid out in order to build a narrative up from pieces that were organised in a manner so that this was possible to do in the first place. A couple examples come to mind, such as when the squire first gives Ballista his sword and tries to show him the evidence of the swap on his phone, though is stopped after the director appears and he leaves quickly when the ceremony begins. Another comes to mind when Nimona is showing Ballista her drawings and uses a variety of animals, which signals towards the fact she could shapeshift in the first place, but this was widely known thanks to the trailers and such already. One more would be when Nimona breathed fire after getting taxed in a game she was playing with Ballista, mirroring one of the moves the Great Shadow Monster was described to have during the opening monologue. I'm sure there are more examples which could be brought up, since some were hidden a lot better and some of them the movie basically told me what had tried to be demonstrated beforehand. Finally, I want to give my thoughts on the characters, since the cast of Nimona were rather dynamic in their roles, whether on the same side or against one another. It would likely be best to start with Nimona herself, since she's the poster child for the thing as a whole, and for good reason, since she fills that spot of being the opposite to Ballista. She likes causing a commotion, enjoys taking violence as the first option if able, and also takes everything with a not so serious attitude unless it is called for. To some extent, she is more of a tragic villain, since she never chose to be demonized, nor did anything to warrant such an offense until the humans had recasted their judgment. Not to mention, she gets 10 extra bonus points for being a shapeshifter, such as I, and utilizes it to a maximum during combat, which can sometimes be a problem when introducing such an entity. Next up, we have Ballista Boldheart, who was framed for the Queen's death. He certainly acts as the brains during the excursion to clear his name, whilst also being resourceful when necessary, likely thanks to his training to become a knight. Though it is his somewhat naive nature that he gets pulled around a lot, whether by Nimona or Ambrosius, as his mind is constantly challenged by alliances forming and breaking with every which way he goes. Thankfully, Ballista's intentions are pure, and he only wishes to do the right thing when able, with things being skewed off the path on occasion in order to not get captured or having to improvise during a mission. To complete the couple, we have Ambrosius Goldenloin, who unfortunately finds themselves jammed in the middle of the conflict. On one hand, they pledge to fight by the sword, and as such would need to bring Ballista in for his alleged crime, but on the other hand, they are still a couple, which is why he struggles so frequently to attack him or actually stop him either. Having to balance this likely puts a burden on Ambrosius, which gets effectively shown during the car ride back to the Institute after Ballista gets away again. It is all bottled up internally and presents a nice dynamic dynamic at the end of the day. Instead of just having Ambrosius stay on Ballister's side from start to finish, there was a strong fight of head and heart going on which needed to be worked out first. That being said, someone who doesn't think for themselves would be the director, our big bad for this movie. As a whole, the director works as a strong villain down to the fact it isn't overly obvious in the lead up to the betrayal, but when things started to go downhill, she noticeably began to shift, having to use intelligence as her first option before using violence when things are at their most dire for her. It really plays into her role as a teacher too, by being so clever, where her being outed is something she can flip back onto Nimona and Ballister when introducing the ancient scrolls and showing footage of her shapeshifting too. To the end, she only believed in the way that Glorif had laid out, despite what had happened right before her eyes. Finally, I want to bring a more of a side character into light, which would be Sir Thaddeus Shoreblade, or Todd, as he is more commonly known as. At every turn, Todd is there to beat down upon Ballister, and acts as a lesser villain in comparison to someone like the director, since he acts more for himself rather than those that surround him, which is shown best when he flees the battle against Nimona. His cowardice is further displayed whenever he confronts Ballister, since he typically has other knights pin him down, so it is easier to hit him without being struck back in turn, while showing no regard for actually bringing him in until he's had his fun. It works as a good mirror to Ambrosius, since Todd doesn't hesitate to attack Ballister or Nimona when she isn't in her Great Shadow Monster form, which means he's serving his purpose well. After all, he was created to act as a more grim version of Ambrosius, as Todd never existed in the original visual novel. Though that is all I can say on the matter as it stands, since I have done my best to probably flesh out why I believe Nimona to be my favourite movie as of 2023, and my second favourite all time, just under A Silent Voice. I think a good indicator for me is if a movie can beckon tears out of me and make me want to jump into the movie all over again after it ends. Nimona is able to do that so well, since it appeals to me in so many ways, from the characters to the fact it is animated and how the world differs to any I have seen up until now. It's even nice to see all the LGBT representation being given as well within the movie, even after Disney tried to snuff it out, and seeing Ballister with Ambrosius is just very sweet. The connection feels genuine and remains strong despite all the trials and tribulations they face in regards to getting back with one another after the dust settles. If a second movie were to be released, I would assume it would be focused on the lands past the walls, and maybe have people who still believe that Glorif was right in the depiction of the world when explaining it to the newer generation that passed her. Maybe it won't happen at all, but I'd be happy leaving it as it is after all. I just wonder how the visual novel will stack up in comparison, but I'm sure you'll hear about that too when it comes. With that being said, this has been Skullman Speaks, and I'll see you next time. Hopefully.